Good morning, everybody. Thank you all ever so much for attending this webinar on how to implement ISO 45003, which was issued last year in 2015, on the psychological health and safety within an existing health and safety system. Sounds quite a mouthful, and it's at the moment it's currently a bit of a guideline to go along with the traditional ISO 45001 Occupational Health and Safety. And from my perspective, having worked through the standard, it's just looking at how to implement it with your existing system. You can't operate it on its own because it needs other things to back it up, but it's just trying to sort of demystify how it actually works. So fingers crossed, the slides will show themselves, and hopefully you'll get some benefit from it. And as I say, I really hope you do. So again, thank you all ever so much for attending. And my name's Claire. I'm a regional assessor for NQA, and welcome. So just to give you a quick refresher really regarding NQA, we are the third largest certification body within the UK for the certification of ISO 9001, ISO 14001, ISO 45001 and also ISO 27001. So the four real main standards. We also have a department or body, office, not quite sure what the phrase would be, in China, particularly for the automotive sector, and we have a good presence in the automotive sector in the UK. We are globally #1 as a company as a whole for telecommunications and the automotive sector. In America, we are America's #1 as a certification body for the aerospace sector, and globally we're #3. And to be honest, that, as far as I'm concerned, is absolutely immense. I find that really, really amazing, because it's one of those things you look at things and you think, how can a company reach that far? But with the advent of the telecommunications that we now have, we can, and I'm just so proud to be a member of this team. I mean, I absolutely love the work that I do. I love doing these things. And also, just as another tiny little thing, we are also the UK's #2 certification body in the aerospace sector. And we all know that from our own experiences with flying, that when we do fly, we're happy knowing that everything is as it should be. The systems that to build the planes, etc., work as they should. So, as I say, absolutely fantastic stuff. What we also do, we do lots of different training and different courses. We specialise in various management systems for ISO 9000, which is the quality system. We've got the aerospace, quality of aerospace, and that is where it's the equipment that go into building the planes. And it's the same with the automotive sector. It's how the cars are built, and it's making sure that technically when the car or the airplane comes off the theoretical production line, it is safe, and it is really good stuff. It's really interesting. So, and we get to see a wide variety of businesses, processes, and from my perspective, and we'll find out a little bit about myself in a few moments, but it's been an amazing, I think it's an amazing thing to do. And we also look at things like, we've got the energy standard, which is ISO 50001. We've also got PAS 2060 and ISO 14001 for the environmental and sustainability. We do ISO 45001, which is the Occupational Health and Safety. Information resilience, which in current situations at the moment, absolutely critical. We're involved with in the food safety auditing and making sure that, to a point, the food that you buy in the supermarkets is as it should be, making sure that the manufacturing processes are as they should be. The same with the building and designing of medical devices. I mean, when I joined NQA, this absolutely blew my mind. And it's also the same with risk management, and it's training services. It's giving you guidance as to how to do training, how to put together a risk assessment. Because when you start on this road to certification and trying to get a system up and running, sometimes it can be very, very daunting. It's like, how do I start doing a risk assessment? How do I start doing any assessments? And it's just as it is. And we do a whole range of courses. We have the virtual learning, which is really good. I've done some of them myself. We've done e-learning, and obviously we've got the webinars, and I've done some e-learning courses with NQA, and I'll tell you something, really good standard of information. So really, from my perspective, lots of good stuff. We also do in-house training where, for the numbers of people that you as a company may have, you may be better off actually having one of our assessors or trainers coming in and actually providing the training on site. So really good stuff. And also we have various locations dotted around the UK where we can actually have rooms where we can do one-day training session, like an introductory courses, 2-day implementation courses, internal auditor courses for NQA and also IRCA, and also 5-day lead auditor courses for IRCA, for NQA and or IRCA, and also CQI, so basically the approved training partners of NQA. So some really good stuff. Now, just as a little bit about myself, from 2005 until 2020, I oversaw and audited and maintained environmental management for a small chemical, when I say small chemical manufacturing company, they went from 4 sites to 10. And in 2016, 2017, managed to actually get all the sites certified to ISO 45001 2000, not 45001, I do apologise, ISO 14001 2015, and did some really interesting stuff, learned lots and lots of information, was involved in the company health and safety management system, dealt with COMA, worked with the local authority, COMA exercises, worked with the local authority. And there's a nice picture of me, and basically to put name to the face. And there is with this presentation, there is the facility to ask questions. Well, I appreciate it if possible, and I know sometimes when the question pops in your head, you want to ask it straight away. If you could leave it to the end, that would be fantastic. But don't worry if it literally comes straight to you and you have to send it. I will get to it as soon as practical, but obviously my main concern at the moment is conducting this presentation. But most importantly, you will receive a copy of the slide deck and a recording of the webinar on completion. And as always, if we can power through something you'd like to dwell on, then that means that if there's something you want to reread on, you can do that at your own leisure. But you will get a copy of the webinar on the slides. So without further ado, moving onwards, and basically what we're doing today is we're just looking at clauses 7, 8 and 9. Now, and the idea is, what will you learn, what will you understand? There's a lot to understand. The traditional ISO 45001 standard is quite a daunting document, and the 45003 are guidelines. Now, my colleague Terry Fisher 2 weeks ago did a webinar very similar to this, but on the introduction to ISO 45003, and that is still available. And if you do have problems uploading it, downloading it, I'm not quite sure what the phrase is, then just please contact us, and NQA will help you out with that. So the whole idea of how 45003 is, what I'm trying to do today is to almost sort of demystify it so it doesn't seem as daunting as it initially appears. So what we're looking at realistically are the psychosocial hazards, and in the current place that we are in the world at the moment, we've had 3 years-ish of COVID and the impact of COVID, and it's had things like there's been work-related stress that people have been under because either they've had to go to the workplace during COVID or they've had to work at home and they've not seen people. But psychosocial hazards also are things such as bullying, harassment, the effects of lone working or remote working, violence in the workplace, employee to employee, because there's always, unfortunately, somebody that never quite as nice as we would like to think that our work colleagues will be. Fatigue, and that can just be tiredness due to the amount of hours that you're working, or it could be the type of job that you're doing. And the other way that fatigue can be a psychosocial hazard is literally you've spent all day thinking about what you're doing and why you're doing it, and it literally is that pressure on the brain, and it can really, really drain you. And then there's drug and alcohol use. Now, some people will have a glass of wine at the end of the day, bottle of beer. Some people will use other products because that's their way of what they think is de-stressing. But the problem is with those sort of behaviours is people can then become dependent on having that one glass of wine at night. They might become dependent on having, the longer phase, drug use. Another example of that is tobacco. Maybe like instead of having 2 or 3 cigarettes a day, you go up to 5, you go up to 10, up to a packet. Again, tobacco and the nicotine in tobacco is the drug. And also with psychosocial hazards, it's also changes in people's behaviour. And that's one of the hardest ones to actually spot, because there's the psychological hazards that when someone's behaviour changes, it has that impact in the workplace, and it can impact how a manual task is completed. It can be like vocal fatigue. It could be that somebody just doesn't want to talk to anybody, wants to go and sit in the corner of the room and just not talk to anybody. It can be a visual fatigue. It can be workplace bullying. There's occupational stress. And depending on the job that you do, depending on the area that you work in, occupational stress may be a major factor, maybe a major side effect as such of the job that you do. And then you also have violence and client aggression. And sometimes it can be not with the people that you work with. It can actually be people outside of the organisation that you work for. It could be an impact of that company's reputation, and it could be the neighbourhood that the facility is located in. There are lots and lots of different reasons. So what we're going to try and do today is just try and understand how some of these possibly happen and how it can impact on you or the team of people that work with you. So first up is clause 7. Clause 7, it's the same in ISO 14001, 45001, 9001. It follows the format of Annex SL. So 7.1 is resources. And as with ISO 45001, the guidelines indicate that along with determining and providing resources, it should also detail the details that the organisation should maintain the resources. So it's suggesting that the company should include psychosocial health and safety along with occupational health and safety, and to try and treat them both equally as possible. This can be done if an organisation offers mental health first aiders, or if the company you work for is good enough, lucky enough to provide private healthcare, ensuring that mental health is included in the package, because a lot of the private healthcare providers do that. And yeah, another way of doing this, of including this, and it's doing it almost without actually realising, is health monitoring that the company might do. Depending on the industry that you work in, you may do health monitoring for your employees. You can include mental health check during the normal standard health check. So as much as you may have a lung function test, check eyesight, musculoskeletal issues, you can also have the person from the health monitoring company that you just ask them a couple of questions. Anything stressful going on in your life? It could just be something outside of outside of the workplace, but it has that impact. It can have that impact inside the workplace. So the whole idea with the resources is it's to enable the organisation to achieve the objectives. And resources such as humans, technology can also be utilised along with financial resources, because companies, unfortunately, do not have a bottomless pit of money to create systems, and so they may tag something on, again, as with health monitoring. It could go into that thing. And then what we're looking at next stage is competence, and this is quite detailed as such. And with clause 7.2 competence, there are two sub-clauses. You've got 7.2.1. And basically, along with the standard requirements to determine necessary competence to ensure that workers are competent to take action, it's been able to identify if I continue watching what people do and take action to enable competence to be developed and maintained, and then have the appropriate documentation, which you can then use as evidence of compliance for when you do your internal auditing or internal checks. 45,003 standard also details that any psychosocial risk training enables the trainee to identify hazards and how they can be managed. In other words, how they interact, how they impact other hazards. And it also suggests that the organisation should ensure that the workers and other interested parties not just have the competence, but also the opportunity to implement measures and the processes for preventing the risk. It's also understanding how the message is distributed within the organisation, enable employees to understand how to approach, report concerns. And examples of this can be identified via continued unintended lone working. It's if there's a team of 2 employees working together, because that's what the process requires, one leaves, with one employer left remaining to complete the work of 2 people. And the organisation could be reluctant to hire or replace, or it could even be they're unable to replace because the level of candidates applying for the job isn't particularly good. But there's also standard lone working, and that is things such as lorry drivers. And if somebody works on their own, it's watching how their behaviour changes. Does their attitude change? Does their temperament change? Because that's one of the risks of working on their own. And it can be discussed with those who are trained. The train changes to operate the procedures either in documents, flowcharts, for example, to reduce the risk. Include invitations to management meetings, not just health and safety committee meetings. So when a manufacturing company is purchasing their equipment, or they make a design change of the plant, it's getting employees' feedback to say, well, actually, no, we need 3 people to run this, not 2. It's too much work for 2 people. If someone's off, it's 1 person working on their own, and it's one of those strange, weird things. And then the whole idea with reporting stuff is enabling employees to understand that they can approach people within the company to report concerns or worries even, and it means that they can then encourage somebody to get help instead of potentially what if they hadn't, what if I'd said something to somebody. It's one of those really strange things, and it's sourcing and utilising advice or guidance from external bodies such as HSE website, mental health charities, healthcare organisations. And also there's this other thing that we need to take into account: needs, experience, language skills, literacy, and also the diversity of workers, because some groups within society see mental health issues as a weakness. People want to illustrate to their colleagues that there's nothing wrong, it's portraying a false image. And as an example of this, the HSE have literally just recently run a campaign aimed at the construction industry, saying it's good to talk. And it's just that thing of making sure that the people that you have available to talk to, that your employees can talk to, they have the training, they have the knowledge, they have that. I'm not quite sure what the word I want to use, to be honest, on that one. And then the other sub-clause is clause 7.2.2, and this is basically where the organisation should establish the competence for all levels within the organisation that have management responsibilities. And it's interesting to note at this point that some industry sectors provide training on how to be a manager, and other sectors think it can be learned on the job, it can be taught on the job as the employee progresses through the organisation. But it's not quite like that anymore. The way business works now, training is a good idea on how to be a manager, because it gives the management team guidance on how to approach people, the right tone of voice to use to reduce the potential for confrontation. It's to build relationships within a company. And then with the competence side of it as well, picking out who performs the risk assessments to do these? Do they have knowledge of psychosocial risks? Do they have knowledge or experience of being able to identify these risks? And then if they produce control measures, when they're implemented along with other interventions, ensuring that everybody understands why these things are being put into place, and ensuring that the people providing the training show a good level of understanding. And also from an auditor's perspective, it's ensuring that those that complete the evaluations and the reviews of the process are suitably trained. So we would check things like training records, training courses that people have done, and it could be that we see something and think, hey, you know what, that's a really good course, because we've seen the course documentation. You know what, that's a really, really good course to attend. And just making sure that when you have these people in place, that you have the confidence they know what they are looking for, they know what they are doing. And then you have a lovely little clause, 7.3 awareness, always an awkward one from a standards perspective, because different people view awareness in different ways. So this, in comparison to 45,001, is more detailed with the levels of awareness. So what it is, for example, informing employees and other interested parties that are in the workplace, in other words, contractors, subcontractors, visitors, that working in this workplace has the potential to affect health, safety and wellbeing at work. There is that potential to create or increase stigma or even discrimination. And from that example, it's sometimes with a company, if they haven't got a good standing in the local community, and I use, for example, that if a known company has a major incident and it's widely reported in, be it local press, national press, and I use, for example, in February 2016, 3 employees from Coleman and Company were killed during the demolition of a boiler house at Didcot Power Station. That made national news. As much as what happened was absolutely horrific, possibly up until that point, they may not have had a particularly good reputation within its local community. And moving forward, it probably may still not have a good reputation in the local community. And people that work for the company might not want to say who they work for, because they'd be subjected to comments like, well, why do you want to work for them? You know, people die working for them. And that can create a stigma and a discrimination. And it can also put an extra level of stress on an employee, because they're conscious of what their friends think, or friends, colleagues, acquaintances think of the company they work for. So the whole idea with the level of awareness is trying to reduce those risks, and also trying to provide support in the roles and responsibilities of the employees to promote health, safety and also wellbeing within the workplace. And the whole idea is, when developing this awareness, the organisation needs to take into account factors such as the importance of top management support. So in other words, top management not being dismissive of an issue, and if something gets reported, that they provide protection for the person that's reported it, because sometimes it doesn't quite work like that, and it's what is known in other trades as whistleblowing. It's not intentionally whistleblowing, it's just making people aware. And then also there are the risks, opportunities and impacts arising from the change in the workplace. And if an incident does happen on site, people's attitude to what they do and how they do things changes. And I use an example where the company has an incident, everybody's suddenly aware of what they're actually working with, if they're working with chemicals. But 4 months down the line, they've gone back to almost a nonchalant viewpoint, because they've gone back to being used to working with the product. They've not forgotten the hazards, they've just, it's not the same anymore. Everything's gone back to how it was, and it's how they work, and it's one of those things of trying to work out, how do we implement the change in the workplace? How do we identify and take action to eliminate the stigma or the discrimination? And it can be exceptionally difficult to do, particularly when it's in the local community. And companies can do these wonderful events where they liaise with the local community, they do like open days, etc., depending on the facility. But there's only so much relationship building that they can do. So it is interesting. And that really leads on to communication. And with 7.4 communication, it is being able to open channels of communication from top management down to work at employee level, but also promoting the feedback to top management. And communication is a good tool because it enables the organisation to demonstrate its commitment to managing the psychosocial risks. Promotion of wellbeing, plus informing employees and interested parties what can be expected of them by the organisation. But far more importantly is what they can expect from the organisation. So, and as an example of this is the impact on employees when an accident involves a team member either on-site or off-site. Because depending on the hours worked, the people you work with become your work family. And if one of them is injured in an accident on-site or off-site, it can affect how you tackle the daily job. And if a member of your team becomes seriously ill, it's also the fact that if, depending on the illness, depending on how they decide to address the illness, if they're still able to work, they might be treated differently by their colleagues. And then it could be there are colleagues that have had a similar sort of illness, and from a basic reporting of it, it could be that thing of, oh, when I had that, it wasn't that bad. And I mean, the best example we have at the moment is how various people have their bodies reacted to COVID. Lots of different people, many thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people have now had COVID, but no two people have had the same experience with COVID. And it's how do we protect that person in the workplace? And it's also from the information that goes on in the workplace, it's how work-related changes can impact health and safety and wellbeing at the workplace. And it's things like, if you're in the manufacturing sector, you may have some new contracts, but the work product is required fairly quickly. It could mean that they may request that you work more hours. So you spend more time in the workplace than you do at home, but it's still within the legal hours to work. But that can have an impact on how your mental health works. And it's also communicating how potentially employee illness can have how employees view their colleagues and how they treat them. That can affect workplace morale. And there are things that can be done from a communications perspective. It's the use of notice boards, promoting wellbeing programs, be either things provided by the local authority, but local leisure centres, etc., yoga classes, but also things down to as simple as providing colouring books and pencils. Sounds daft, but it's one of those things where just sitting there, and I've done it myself, colouring book and pencils, not having to think about what you're doing, it takes you away from that issue, and it takes your mind out of that place, and it just allows you to sort of like a bit of downtime to sit there and breathe and think, okay, we've got this. And then documented information. Now this, as we all know, is one of the things that's really critical in a management system. And what it's saying is that from the auditor's perspective, what we're looking at is we will be looking at how documented information should include processes for the management of these risks, details of the roles and responsibilities, and also the authorities within the company. So it's mental health first aiders, it's provision of services, it's also risk assessments on the psychosocial risk, it's also then how these are monitored, evaluated, and if changes are then made to the control measures, their effectiveness. And also at some point in time, there's also legal requirements, and it's ensuring that from a company's perspective, so your perspective, that you're looking after employees. And then out of all of the clauses and sub-clauses in this standard, and also any standard, is confidentiality. It's probably the most critical. And the organisation should establish a process related to the risk that ensures confidentiality of personal information. And it's people that are mental health first aiders. It's made so that they understand that what goes on between them and the person that's come to speak to them remains confidential. It's almost, I could almost compare it to a point very similarly to the, how do I put this? The relationship that you have with your doctor. The Hippocratic Oath, not the Hippocratic Oath, but the fact that the doctor isn't allowed to talk to anybody about what they've heard from you, the person. So it's maintaining confidentiality of documented information. And that, from that perspective, that is if when somebody has been off work for a reason and they've had doctor's notes, etc., and there's been communication from their health providers saying to HR, look, this is what's happened, this is what we're doing, and we need you to ensure that this information doesn't get out. Because it is all, some of the reasons that people have issues can be incredibly deeply personal, and it's being able to respect that individual worker's experience of it. And also what we also do with the confidentiality is to protect against disclosure of the outcomes following exposure to a hazard, for medical treatment, time away from the workplace, flexible working arrangements. And it's also to let the employee know that if there are any limits that apply to confidentiality, the information they've told them. And with HR, it's that thing for the protection of disclosure. It's if somebody's been off for a period of time, it's ensuring that certain things are in place so that when that person comes back to work, they're not possibly exposed to the hazards or the issues that they may have had previously. And it's to sort of reduce the impact. The clause 7, fairly detailed in comparison to what's required on the other standards, because obviously you've got a few extra sub clauses. So we now move on to clause 8, operations. Now, in the grand scheme of things, this actually seems a lot easier when you start reading it through, because initially you think, oh, good grief, we've got to do this, this and this. But the whole idea with operations is think about what is required under ISO 45001, because the aim of these sub-clauses in ISO, in clause 8, is to advise the organisation that to plan, to implement, to control, to maintain processes to adequately and effectively manage the risks and new opportunities. So in other words, look at how can we eliminate a problem. So in other words, as an example, it could be, how do we reduce the stress? Well, we can change, could be a change in production method. It could be an increase in employees, so the workload is distributed. So as an example, a company of a certain size, say over 250 people, they have one draftsperson. But the workload is such, it's too much for one person, so they hire somebody else. And then they still look at the workload and they think, you know what, we still need to hire somebody else. So that is elimination, but also to a point, also analysing and managing existing controls so that it promotes a better sense of well-being in the workplace. And trying to complete an assessment of psychosocial risks is daunting. It's trying to look at what the original controls were. And if we think about it, we're looking at things such as changes in behaviour, as mentioned earlier, changes in behaviour, lack of engagement, high staff turnover. We'll touch on those in a few minutes. But also it's utilising various levels of intervention. So it could be, if it's in a factory environment, team leaders talking to the operators that work below them, so to spot that something's not quite right with an operator. It could be that operator he has his tea break, he or she has his tea break, lunch break. They look at what they're doing and think, you know what, they go and sit in a different room, they go and sit in their car. It's looking at, it's like, okay, I need to have a chat with that person. It's not just leave them alone and let them get on with it. And it's also eliminating hazards. So it's, and when you're looking at that, that is more to do with ISO 45001, but it's the knock-on effect for 45003. So eliminating hazards where to stop somebody from getting injured also eliminates somebody suffering from a mental trauma of an incident. So it's one of those things where it does work hand in hand. So as we move on further for clause 8, so it's quite interesting. Another subclause is 8.1.2, which is eliminating the hazards, and it's reducing the risks and promoting wellbeing at work. It's looking at how to identify the hazards and risks, and then determining how to eliminate them or even not reduce. It's looking at dedicated training courses to enable certification of mental health first aiders, looking at operating processes, obviously industry dependent, how are employees treated, number of allocated tasks, interaction with various departments. Do the people in a particular plant, if it's a site that's got a number of plants, do they talk to other departments? Do they talk to other workers, or do they all just stay to themselves? And it also details how to identify changes of exposure to the risk. So you're looking at changes in behaviour, lack of engagement, high staff turnover. It's also social isolation or withdrawal, and it's refusing offers of help. No, I'm fine, I don't need any help. And that's the phrase that you will at times come across. And it's also things like neglecting personal wellbeing. So it's care of appearance, not eating properly. So, or it could even be, oh, I go out every night and I'm never home, etc. I don't need to be home. But also, there's also the conflicts within the workplace, a lack of willingness to cooperate. And that usually happens because there's conflict of personalities. And in some workplaces, there's always somebody that thinks they know absolutely everything. And that's when you have that lack of willingness to cooperate. And there's also this other where it does happen, either being bullied or being the bully. And they are how people sometimes, being the bully is a reaction to how somebody how they deal with that exposure to that risk. Or being bullied is their temperament changes, and to a point the bully sees them as an easy target. And also the other thing is the reduced desire to work with others. And when we think about that, it's that as I mentioned earlier, lone working. If somebody's always been on their own, or they've been working with somebody for a while, that person's left and they've been on their own for 2, 3, 4, 5 months, they may not want to work with anybody else because they've got so used to being on their own. And again, that is reduced desire to work with others. It's also it's a reduction in engagement with other team members. And then we've got the classic clause in 8.2, emergency preparedness and response. Absolute classic for health and safety. And the aim of this clause from the 45,003 perspective is to take into consideration the impact of the emergency on the workplace. Most companies have, predominantly depending on the sector that they work in, it's a case of, it's not just a fire evacuation plan. It's being able to do plans where you can conduct role play to try and determine how people will react in the event of an emergency incident. It's trying to react how they might perform afterwards. And then after an emergency has been dealt with, review should be held to determine what can be improved, what was suitable, and take the time to gather the feedback from everybody involved. This is crucial to enable improvements to be discussed via hot and cold debriefs, is a phrase used within the control of major accident and hazard investigations. It's when you do a drill, the hot debrief is straight afterwards. What did we learn immediately? The cold debrief is a week later, you have that conversation. What did we learn? Is there something that we missed? This then allows the plan to evolve and develop. And this leads on exceptionally well into clause 8.3, which is rehabilitation and return to work. Now, this is a tricky one for some companies because sometimes they think they don't need to do a return to work. But an organisation should design and implement an appropriate return to work programme for an employee. So what that's doing is looking at what they do. So it's risk assessments for the work that they do. So looking from a physical perspective, but also from a psychosocial perspective. So it's looking at the individual employee risk assessments, any data that might be available in a rehabilitation programme, particularly if somebody has I'm trying to think of the phrase, to apologise, broken an arm or broken a bone, and they come back to work, and as much as they have some use, they have say 85% mobility in their arm. Might have an example, they might have torn a muscle in their shoulder. How much will that impact the work that they do? Do they have to have time off for physiotherapy? And with the return to work program, it really should include regular meetings with both HR, the team leader, and the employee to discuss that if the employee is returning at the correct speed for them. And that can be quite difficult to determine, because sometimes, again, it's that image that people portray. I'm fine, I can come back straight away, there's nothing wrong. But then you find that they could be a little bit slower. They're not so much the reaction speed, but how they respond to, it could even be responding to emails. Oh, actually, no, I'll do it later. And then it's also and again, with communication, again, is with the relevant team members, that if somebody comes back to work on restricted hours, restricted duties, it's making the rest of the team members aware that some person's coming back and that their duties have been restricted to enable them to return to work fully, properly and completely at a later date. Because it could be that there may be another little trigger along the way. If they literally jump back into work, feet first, back to how it was before the incident occurred, it may set them back. And it's one of those things where, again, the communication is saying to people, just make sure that check in on that person, make sure that person's okay. Communication during this return to work period, the confidential information with the employees determines if the plan is working. It also determines from feedback from the rest of the team. So did we get the level of return to work correct on this? It could be the person comes back every other day for 4 hours a day. Is that the best way to do things? It's one of those, it's a learning curve for any company. And then we're now on to the final clause for this training session, and I think I'm probably going to go a little bit over time, so I do apologise. But it's literally performance evaluation, which is the same for 9001, 14001, 45001. And the idea is that 9.1 is monitoring and measurement, analysis and performance evaluation. This is used to determine if the policy has been complied with, if any objectives that have been set, have they been met, have risk assessments been reviewed, are there any new hazards? And that walks very much hand in hand with 9.2, which is internal audits. So as with 45001, conduct audits at planned intervals, but include psychosocial risks, plus the management of the risk of that. So with the internal audit, it's reviewing the risk assessment, being able to determine if, by the use of anonymous comment slips, to determine if the help service has been used. And from that perspective, this data is to remain confidential at all times, because people are reporting anonymously, so they know that they can actually say, this is fine, we're happy with this. Or it could be that this isn't quite right. And then you have management review. And again, the template, the agenda, very similar to ISO 45001, but the skill is in the approved methods for obtaining the data without losing its confidentiality. And with subclauses 9.3 and 9.2, these are critical with regards to maintaining a high level of confidentiality that this standard requires. It's one of those things where management review, you have certain people attend it, and it's making sure that when the minutes are put together, the areas it shows that areas are discussed, but the intricate detail isn't included, so that if it's to do with a particular person, the confidentiality aspect of what happened to that person, be it either in work trauma, out of work trauma, it just gives them, they know that yes, people are aware of what's happened, but they don't know the full details of it. So, any questions for me? And I'm hoping that they're not too bad. And if I'm not quite sure of how to answer it, I will respond to you. And sometimes sometimes it can be quite interesting, some of the questions. So I'm just going to wait and see. I've got a couple that I really want to respond to privately, so it'll be a one-on-one answer. But I just wanted to say I do appreciate the fact that all of you have taken the time to attend. Hopefully you found it interesting. Hopefully I haven't made it feel like it's a standard you don't want to get involved with. As I say, at the moment it is a new standard, and it is interesting. So I've now got some questions coming through. Thank you ever so much for those. What I will do is I will respond to them separately. So hopefully you'll be happy with the answers. If not, if you do have any other further questions or queries, then please contact NQA. The team here will endeavour to answer every question that you have. Not quite sure what else to say now, but I just think the last thing is just to say thank you all ever so much for attending, and I will respond to the questions shortly. And I'm hoping that you find the answers interesting and helpful. Thank you.